My name is Tom Peters. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at Missouri State University. We have a special guest with us tonight. Dr. John Ikerd is Professor Emeritus of Agriculture and Applied Economics at the University of Missouri-Columbia in the College of Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources. He's got samples of some of his books down here, and the titles of these publications are indicative of his lifelong interest in and commitment to a sustainable world, including farms and communities such as Springfield and the Missouri State University campus. Some of the titles include things like The Essentials of Economic Sustainability, Sustainable Capitalism, A Matter of Common Sense, Small Farms Are Real Farms, Sustaining People Through Agriculture, Crisis and Opportunity, Sustainability in American Agriculture. So you get a sense of his lifelong interest. He was the state's co-coordinator of extension programs in sustainable agriculture, and as in that role, he was responsible for implementing a national professional development program for extension workers and others who provided Missouri with information related to sustainable agriculture. Dr. Ikerd also was the project leader of a 3-state, 5-year program with funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which links sustainable agriculture and sustainable community development. All of his higher ed degrees, his bachelor degree, master degree, and PhD are in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri. He's also served at the University of Georgia, Oklahoma State University, and North Carolina State University. He retired from the University of Missouri in early 2000, so about 15 years ago. He now spends most of his time writing and speaking on issues related to sustainable agriculture, with an emphasis on the economics of sustainability. He joins us this evening from his home. He drove down yesterday from, I'm an Iowa boy, so I'm pleased to say that he currently lives in Fairfield, Iowa. And please join me in welcoming Dr. John Ikerd.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you this evening. I drove down yesterday, and we've been around today visiting with the folks in the library, and I think that you're very fortunate here to have a library that's committed to the broader community service and providing opportunities for you to get information directly from people visiting the campus, as well as going through the stacks of the library and the computers and various other places. I think that's an important role, and I applaud the library for reaching out to the community and bringing in different kinds of ideas. It's interesting that this coincides with the Conference for Public Affairs, which is about the ethical citizen. I want to focus and close my remarks talking a bit about ethics and morality and things of this nature. And I'll begin with what I consider to be kind of an ethical position on presentation, since as I make tonight, is I would hasten to say that what you hear from me tonight will be my truth. It's what I believe to be true. Now, if your truth is different from mine, that's all right with me. I speak my truth with conviction because I know why I believe what I believe. And all I ask from you is that you speak your truth by, you know why you believe what you believe. I like to come and talk to young people that haven't made their minds yet about how they think the world works and where they fit within it and what they think is true and what they think isn't true. And I hope you haven't made up your mind yet. Too many old people make up their mind in one direction, and even if they're wrong, it's too much trouble and too much aggravation and too costly to change. So I am trying to help you seek your truth, because I don't think any of us should be so egotistical as to think that only we have the truth. I think if we look for our truth and we share our truth with each other, then hopefully we'll move closer to the truth. So that's what I speak from tonight. I want to talk about sustainable agriculture. That's what I've spent the last 25 years doing. And the title of the paper I put it together primarily because of the references. I'll talk about a lot of different information with references. I call Sustainable Agriculture, a battle for the hearts and minds. Battle for the hearts and minds of the American people. And I think that's where we are today. There's a battle going on between sustainable agriculture, and I'll explain more about that, and what I call industrial agriculture. And that battle is going on in the public forum because there's increasing public concerns about our industrial food system, the so-called modern food system that we have today, including what we call our modern agriculture. There's a number of controversies that are eroding public confidence in that system. And you're aware, I hope, of many of those, such as the genetic engineering, genetically modified organisms, the use of agricultural chemicals, pesticides, and fertilizers, and the large-scale confinement animal feeding operations or concentrated animal feeding operations are just some of the most prominent areas of controversy. And just to give you examples of what's going on here, there's 30 states now have laws that for labeling genetically modified foods in the grocery store today. And there's several other states that are considering labeling laws where you would have to label anything that had genetically modified organisms. With respect to the agricultural chemicals, the World Health Organization has just issued a report identifying Roundup, the most widely used herbicide or weed killer in the world, as being a potential carcinogen or cancer-causing. There's a whole host of evidence that indicates the most widely used weed killer in this country for decades, atrazine, is an endocrine disruptor or a probable endocrine disruptor with a whole host of physical problems that could potentially associated with that, from reproductive problems to a whole range of other things in terms of messing up sort of the endocrine system of the human body. So those are in the chemical areas. When you look at the confinement concentrated animal feeding operations, or factory farms, as many people call them today because they look more like factories than a traditional farm, there's 9 states that have outlawed gestation crates. The gestation crates is where the breeding sow, for example, that would spend basically their whole life in a crate about the size of this table up here, so small that can't even turn around. They only come out of that crate when they're having baby pigs, and they're in another crate then, where's the farrowing crates, and they're back into the gestation crate again. There'd be 10 states that have outlawed it, except Governor Christie of New Jersey vetoed a law that the legislature there had passed that would outlaw gestation crates there, and there's movements in several states to do the same thing in other areas. McDonald's just recently joined a whole host of restaurant chains that are saying they're only going to serve cage-free eggs. And cage-free eggs would come from laying hens that aren't put in little cages. A laying hen that's in a caged operation has space less than a sheet of the paper, where they basically spend their whole life in the same pens with other hens that are laying. And increasingly the public is turning against that, and the restaurant industry is saying our customers don't want eggs that are coming out of this kind of operation. Another area of major concern that I think is going to be a big one in the future is the routine feeding of antibiotics to livestock in confinement animal feeding operations, not just for treatments of problems, but to try to prevent problems. And even more so, they found out that routine feeding of antibiotics, a low level of antibiotics, contributes to weight gain. So it's done widely across the industry. Every year, basically, in the House of Representatives, there's people that will introduce bills to ban the routine feeding of antibiotics to livestock. And the support for those bills, those laws, are growing. And this year, under the pressure, the FDA, or Food and Drug Administration, issued voluntary guidelines that were urging people in these operations to quit feeding routine antibiotics to that livestock because it creates antibiotic resistance. They're using the same antibiotics that we're using to treatment of humans, and many diseases are becoming resistant to the point where they're running out of antibiotics to treat humans because of the constant use of the environment in the livestock operations. So there are some of the things that are eroding the public confidence. In response to this, the agricultural establishment, as I call it, has mounted a major public relations campaign over the last several years that are spending, at least the first 2 years, $8 or $9 million a year on a public relations campaign. And one of the most prominent campaigns is put together called the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. They have what they call the Food Dialogues. You can look them up on the internet. And they state specifically that the reason that they have this campaign going forward is to try to restore public confidence and trust in today's agriculture. they realize that there's something fundamentally wrong, that they have a problem because they're losing the public confidence in the integrity of the American food system. And this campaign, this multi-million-dollar campaign, is financed and board of directors of such organizations as the American Farm Bureau Federation and the big commodity organizations, that's the pork producers, soybean producers, hog producers, and so on, but also by the large agribusiness companies such as Monsanto and DuPont, both of which have pledged $500,000 a year in support of this particular campaign, and others across the country in similar place. And John Deere and others are on the board and contributing to it. And one of the major kind of campaigns that they have, if you go look at the website, is called the Faces of Farming and Ranching. And they've selected articulate, attractive, young farmers and ranchers to come on and say, I'm an environmentalist and I'm a farmer. I'm committed to taking care of the water and the air. I'm an animal welfare specialist and I'm a farmer, and it shows them in the CAFEFO operation. I'm a member of the community and a solid volunteer, and I'm a farmer. And what they're trying to do is do everything they can, and they're doing a good job of it, to put an attractive face on the increasingly ugly business of industrial agriculture. And they've hired some of the best public relations firms in the country, and they have the money to do it. They spent basically $1.5 million on the campaign here in Missouri on Amendment 1, the so-called Right to Farm Amendment, and barely got it passed with 2,500 votes or something of that nature. But they've got a deep war chest, and they're using it, and they're good at it. And what they basically say, if you go look at the campaign, and it's on the internet, and there's others that are similar, is they're saying what we have to do is mount this public relations campaign because the facts and information no longer influence public opinion. We have to resort to emotional appeal. It's interesting that for decades, the critics of industrial agriculture, big operations and things, livestock operations and so on, they were saying, you're just relying on emotion, that you're not relying on sound science. And so they would say, we want regulations based on sound science. We want information based on sound science. But now they say that the sound science doesn't influence opinion, so now we have a campaign that we're trying to base our appeal upon the emotion by showing the faces of the farmers and ranchers and so on. But in that campaign, they still say, basically trying to label the critics as being uninformed, emotional, radical, environmentalist, anti-rightist, NIMBYs, a whole range of things. But I've worked with these folks over the year now. I'll give you a little more history after a while, but I've worked for these folks over the past 20 years. And I don't see that. I think these people some of them are emotional because their whole quality of life has been destroyed. Their kids are sick, and they're sick, and they can't go out stores and enjoy their property and things of that nature. But they've informed themselves. They're well informed on these issues. They're concerned about what's happening. But the big agricultural universities no longer have a monopoly on the information. And the information is out on the internet. And we've had these big animal operations now for 50 years, and we have a long history, and there's been credible research that I'll report before. So they're basically not outside agitators or whatever. They're concerned about their backyard, but they're also concerned about their neighbors' backyards and other people's backyards as well. And most of these people have never been involved in any sort of a public protest or political action or anything of that nature before, until this was imposed upon them. Either it polluted their wells or destroyed their water supply, or their kids are sick or something of this nature, and they become concerned and they inform themselves. And they do have support from organizations such as the Humane Society of the U.S. and the Sierra Club, because they have like concerns. They share concerns about the industrial food system as a whole. But it's basically just middle Americans trying to protect their health and the health of their families and the quality and the way of life that they've had in these rural communities. And many of them are multi-generational family farmers that have the big operations move in next to them or have an operation expand next to them. And I'd like to say at this point, that I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian or an animal rightist or anything. In fact, I'm a long-term advocate of agriculture. I grew up on a small dairy farm up here at Conway, Missouri, about 35, 40 miles from here, and my brother is still on that small farm where I grew up. As you heard my, kind of resume where I went off to school, I went to school at the University of Missouri and got an undergraduate degree in agricultural economics. When I got out of school, I went to work for Wilson Meatpacking Company, the fourth largest meat packer in the country at that time, in sales, promotion, and advertising, and so on. And while I was waiting to go into the Army during that span of time, I worked for about 6 months at the Kansas City stockyards, and I've been involved in animal agriculture during that time. I was an extension agricultural economist, but I was a livestock marketing specialist, and I helped basically start the big hog industry in North Carolina. We were trying to find an alternative to tobacco down there for the small farmers. We were working with greater feed pig co-ops and greater feeder pig sales and things of that nature, but it evolved into, that's where the industrialization of the hog business started, the large confinement animal feeding operations down in North Carolina. I worked with the big feedlots when I was out in Oklahoma, the Hitch feeders and others that are out there, some of the big cattle feedlots. So I was involved in animal agriculture, big agriculture. I worked with the big peanut and soybean producers when I was a department head in Extension Ag Econ at the University of Georgia. And during that whole time, basically, I was promoting the industrial model of agriculture. You see, that's what I was taught in graduate school and undergraduate in agricultural economics, and that's what I believe. What we were going to do is we were going to make agriculture more efficient. We were going to make it more efficient so we could specialize and standardize, and make it work like a factory. I used to tell people, that the farm has to be a bottom line business, and the farm is a factory without a roof, and the fields and the feedlots need to work like biological assembly lines, because that's the way you increase the efficiency of agriculture. And what we were going to do is bring down the cost of production. We were going to bring down the cost of food, and we were going to make good, wholesome, healthful food affordable and accessible to everyone. And it was a noble cause. And I understand the people that advocate that kind of agriculture. I tell people I know about it because that's where I used to work and live, was in industrial agriculture. But obviously I've changed my mind over the years. We can go into detail later into questions and answers, and I will leave time for your truth if you want to, but I began to see during the 1980s, when we'd gone through a decade of high prosperity in agriculture and farmers had expanded because it was profitable. We were going to feed the world through the international markets, and that was when Plant Fence Row to Fence Row with Earl Butz, and I believed in Earl Butz when he was talking about get big or get out, and there were a lot of farmers that did get big rather than get out during that period of time. And they had expanded during a time when they borrowed a good deal of money in order to expand. And unfortunately, we got into the 1980s, and we agricultural economists had been wrong. And rather than the export markets going on forever, we got into a domestic recession that spread to a global recession. The export markets dried up. Commodity prices fell like a rock, and farmers were caught with huge debts at record high interest rates, and they simply couldn't repay the loans. And foreclosures and bankruptcies on farms were regular fare on the evening network news. And more than one farmer, several farmers, even in the state of Georgia at that time, committed suicide because they lost their farm. And I said, there's something fundamentally wrong with this kind of agriculture. I could see that it certainly wasn't good for those family farmers that I'd been trying to help, and I thought I was helping because they were being forced out of business, because in order for some farmers to get bigger, other farmers had to get out, and many of those farmers didn't leave voluntarily. They didn't leave until they were forced out. It wasn't good for the rural communities that depended upon those farmers for the shop on Main Street and to have kids to go to school and have enough people to afford a doctor and have people to serve on the volunteer fire departments and in the local city councils. I could see the rural communities withering and dying as the farmers were forced off the farm and out of the rural communities, because it takes people to support rural communities, not just production. And it was only then that I began to understand the negative impact on the land, the soil erosion, the pollution of the air and water with agricultural chemicals and pesticides and things of this nature. And so I had to change my thinking, and I got to the point where I simply could not support that kind of agriculture anymore. And I've spent the last 25 years now supporting a different model of agriculture, a way of farming that's committed to finding ways of farms that take care of the land, that's environmentally, ecologically sound, that's socially responsible, that's good for families, that's good for rural communities, and also a kind of agriculture that's economically viable. It has to make sense economically. If it's not profitable, it's not sustainable, but not at the expense of the natural environment and not at the expense of communities and the land. That's what sustainability is about. It's about taking care of the land, taking care of people, because you see, I can tell you as an economist, everything that's of any use to us, which includes everything of economic value, ultimately comes from the earth. It's just more obvious in agriculture than elsewhere. But everything comes from the air, the water, the soil, the energy, all of those things of the earth. There isn't any place to get anything else, including anything of economic value. And if you go beyond self-sufficiency, just going into nature and fending for ourselves, then we have to depend upon relationships with other people to get that usefulness from nature in order for the economy to be sustainable and so on. And so if we destroy the usefulness of nature, if we pollute the natural environment, degrade the productivity of the soil, use up the natural resources, we have nothing from which to extract economic value. And if we destroy the civility of our society or the structure of our community or our ability to get along together, the productivity of our people, then we have no way to support the economy. So to be sustainable, agriculture has to be ecologically sound, socially responsible to be economically viable. It's just more clear in agriculture, but the same is true of the economy, society as a whole. That's what sustainability is about. It's about meeting the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for the future, which means that you have to take care of the land, you have to take care of people in order to sustain the individual economically. And when we look at our agriculture today and we look at our food system, and if we ask the question honestly and fairly, are we meeting the needs of people, everybody today, without diminishing opportunities for the future? The answer to that question is we're not meeting the needs of many, if not most people of the world today, and we certainly are not leaving equal or better opportunities for those people of the future. I tell people in animal agriculture and agriculture in general, what we need is not spending millions of dollars on a public relation campaign. We need to be spending millions of dollars figuring out how we're going to change agriculture so we can restore the public confidence by having an agriculture that is sustainable, that meets the needs of all the people without diminishing opportunities for the future. And there's a whole host of science studies to back up what I've said, and I'll just hit the high points, and the references are in my paper. But I've got where I quote more and more what I call the meta studies, where there's one study that will have 150 or 200 different references that support it, and one of those is put together by the Pew Charitable Trust, which is an organization of great integrity and asks questions and explores a lot of different kinds of issues. And they had a 2.5-year study of industrial animal agriculture, what we would call CAFOs, and they had a former Secretary of Agriculture and a former governor and a whole range of scientists and other people on this commission. And after 2.5 years, the report come up, and it's on the internet and elsewhere. They said this industrial form of agriculture represented unacceptable risk to public health, the environment, and the welfare of the animals. And they went on to say that the negative impacts of industrial animal agriculture were simply too great, and the scientific evidence was too strong to be ignored, and that change was absolutely necessary and should begin now. 5 years later, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, Johns Hopkins University, went back and looked at the recommendations of that committee and concluded that virtually nothing had been done. Nothing had changed. With respect to the specific issues, we're told that genetically modified organisms have been tested. The scientific community has concluded it's safe. That simply is not true. The public health risk assessments were never done on genetically modified organisms. If you want the research and the backing on that, there's a new book called Altered Genes and Twisted Truth by Stephen Drucker, who was a lawyer that represented 9 scientists that sued the FDA because the studies were never done. They simply come in and said, by regulators that had also worked for Monsanto and other places, they concluded that genetically modified organisms were substantially equivalent to those that had been developed through normal breeding processes, and which meant that they could be considered as generally recognized as safe, both of which are legal terms, which meant they never had to be tested. And the few independent tests that were done, and it's reported in the book, indicated significant health risks that have never been addressed. The research has not been done to prove one way or another whether they're safe or not, and we're in the middle of a giant human experiment with it in almost all of our food, and we don't know one way or the other. The Huffington Post did a survey, and 82% of the people in the U.S. want GMOs to be labeled in the grocery store so that people can decide for themselves whether or not they're going to eat it, and will know that it's there. But yet they continue to resist labeling, and it's fighting its way through the state process. Only 8% said that it didn't need to be labeled. 9% said they didn't know one way or another. That issue hasn't been solved. I don't know whether they're safe or not, and neither does anyone else, and that's the reason the public is concerned. With respect to water quality, the propaganda says that farmers are good stewards of the land. They take care of the land and water, and some of them certainly do. I'm not saying that the farmer out there is irresponsible, and I'm not blaming them for the GMOs. But the fact of the matter is that we've known for decades that there are huge dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, the Chesapeake Bay, and various other places, and they are being largely caused by the overuse and misuse of pesticides, fertilizers, primarily fertilizers on big industrial operations, cropping operations, but also by the large-scale confinement animal feeding operations. There was a study done by the EPA in the late 1990s, 1998 report came out, and they were getting ready to sue the big livestock corporations that had the CAFOs. The EPA was getting ready to sue them for violation of the Clean Water Act. We had a change in administration, and that never happened, and they haven't done anything since. But in that study, 35,000 miles of streams, they said, had been polluted by the large-scale confinement animal feeding operations in 22 states. And 17 states had groundwater that had been polluted. That was 1998. People say, well, the manure management practices have improved. We've got precision farming, and now farmers are making better use of their pesticides and things like that. But just this last month or so ago, we had the Des Moines Water Works in Des Moines, Iowa, that sued 4 counties because the nitrogen level in the Raccoon River was so high they had to spend millions of dollars on a new water treatment plant. And the nitrates are coming from the overuse of nitrogen on the corn crops. And the people argue on the confinement operations. They say, well, we're doing a better job than the farmers did before when you had the independent hog operations. As I said, we haven't specifically gone to the livestock operations, but Iowa Department of Natural Resources keeps track of what they call impaired waters. And between the years of 2002 and 2012, there was a tripling in the number of impaired waters in the state of Iowa. The period of time when the industrial livestock operations were replacing our independent hog farmers, and when we were producing all out on corn to produce ethanol so we could burn it in our cars. And we're polluting our rivers in the process. And this isn't just an environmental issue where we're concerned about the frogs and the fish that are killed in the stream, which is certainly important. But if you have an animal operation that qualifies like the minimum sort of level to be significantly regulated, which would be 1,000 animal units, which would be like 2,500 hogs, which is basically a relatively small CAFO, they put out as much biological waste as a town of 7,500 to 10,000 people. Can you imagine having a town of 10,000 people and you tell the people just dump your slop jars, your sewage, out in your yard and let it wash away with the stormwater? But basically that's legal, and that's what's happening. It's untreated manure that's being spread on the land all around these people, and it has the same potential cause the health risk of cities of thousands. I was up in Wisconsin recently, and there was a hog operation that had been proposed within like 6 miles of Lake Superior and a national Apostle Islands national seashore. And it was the equivalent of 50,000 people was the number of hogs that were going in right to a river that strained into that stream. So, this is a public health issue out here. With respect to animal welfare, you see the pictures of the pretty little pigs where the pens are half full and everything's been scrubbed clean. But the reality is, it's quite different than that. And the public relations will say, well, farmers have an economic incentive to take good care of these animals because otherwise it wouldn't be profitable. But we've created an industry where you can make a lot of money off of sick animals, and that's what we're doing. What we do is we simply kill those animals before they have time to have significant weight loss or to die, or most of them to die. We have a horrendous high death loss from the problems that are caused from the inhumane treatment, not intentional, just crowding too many animals together. A pig normally lives, a normal lifespan for a pig is about 10 to 15 years, but we kill them in 6 months. A cow, a dairy cow, when I grew up on a dairy farm, we would have cows that would be 17, 18 years old. The average lifespan now of a dairy cow is about 4 to 5 years, and then they're ready to go off to the factory because we pushed them so hard to milk so hard. Chicken can live anywhere from 7 to 15 years. We kill them in 6 months or so. I have a friend that's a veterinarian that's worked in the meat packing plants, and others have told me the same thing, that a very large percentage of the livers of beef and pork have abscesses and have all sorts of diseases to them because we're feeding them so heavy we're destroying their liver, but we kill them to eat before the diseased livers kill them off. They're simply not happening there. The only thing you respond to in those operations is the economic incentive. The fact that this is a sentient animal that has feelings, that we're part of that same thing, that we share many of the same feelings, that just doesn't come into consideration. You don't have to be a radical animal rights activist to be concerned about what's going on here. I had an opportunity to visit Poland a few years back, and I was in the city of Lublin, which was next to the Nazi concentration camp that was eventually an extermination camp at Majdanek. And they took me out and let me tour that place, and I could see those rows of barracks, where they kept those people in those cramped quarters all crammed up together until they waited to go to the gas chamber. And I thought, well, it looks a lot like the hogs and chicken houses that I see out through the Midwest. It's just too many animals in too small a space. It's the system's fault. It's not that you have mean people. It's just the system that's being created that make it virtually impossible to consistently have humane treatment or environmentally sound or anything else. And we see the results of it. We're told that we have the safest, most healthful food system in the world, and there probably was a time when that was true. Sometime probably when I was back working in the packing houses, we had good meat inspection and all that sort of going on, and that's deteriorated. And what we see now is, the recalls of animal products hadn't become routine yet, but it's sure far from common. They don't even report it on the news anymore unless somebody dies from it. But we have recalls. You can go on, the FDA keeps it on the internet. You can go check out the recalls for Salmonella, Listeria, Campylobacter, E. coli, a whole range of things. And like I say, it's not routine, but it's out there. And they do studies, or scientific studies that have been done where they sample in the grocery store. They find a very large percentage, particularly of chicken, but other products as well, that are contaminated with salmonella and listeria and various other things. Recent studies have checked for antibiotic resistant. A high portion of the bacteria that are on those animals are resistant to one or more or several bacteria, several antibiotics, I should say. What we said, people say, well, just cook it. It's if we go to the store and a chicken is a toxic waste product that has to be brought home and sanitized before we eat it rather than an animal product. And it concerns people when you have to do that and when you hear that coming up time after time. When it comes to antibiotic resistance, I think that's one of the biggest problems that's looming, because antibiotic-resistant bacteria such as MRSA now kills more people than AIDS and a half a dozen other minor diseases. Over 23,000 people last year was killed from MRSA, and there's growing evidence that certainly it comes out of hospitals, and that's one of the places where antibiotics get misused, but it's also in the livestock operations. There was a study done by the General Accounting Office in 2004 that said that there's a high incidence. You create a natural environment with low-level feeding of antibiotics to livestock over time. The resistant bacteria survive and multiply. That's the reason you go to a doctor and they give you a dose of antibiotics. They say take the full dose, take the whole dose, because you want to kill off all the bacteria. When you have the low level, in this GAO report that came out in 2004, you said, we're creating ideal breeding grounds for antibiotic resistance in these operations out here. And they also documented that about 80% of all the antibiotics in this country are not used for humans, but they're used on animals in these livestock operations. 70% of it is fed, 70% of all antibiotics is fed to animals routinely, primarily for weight gain. Increase gains rather than treat illnesses. There's an ongoing, as I said, attempt for legislation. In 2004, the USDA come in and said, well, there's studies out here that indicate that there's some doubt about the linkage between feeding the antibiotics to livestock and human health risk. 2013, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention come out, and they reviewed the reports and reviewed a lot of the scientific evidence in 2003, and they said scientists around the world have provided strong evidence of the linkage between antibiotic resistance and routine feeding of antibiotics in livestock operations. They said it creates an ideal breeding ground for livestock antibiotic resistance, and they said it transfers from the livestock to the food system. That's science. That's the bottom line. I haven't even mentioned the odors yet. That's the things that people complain about, folks, from the animal operations. The PR says, well, this is just a normal part of farming, just like the farm I grew up on, and some of you may have grown up on as well, that just farms have odors, and they do, and farms have dusts and things of this nature. But that statement simply isn't true. There's a fundamental difference between the decomposition of manure when it's spread out on the fields in an aerobic process where it has access to oxygen, and the anaerobic process where it's in these manure pits and in lagoons where it doesn't get oxygen. And it creates a whole different set of chemical compounds with a whole different set of health risk. There's dozens of different organisms and chemicals and various things in these odors. It isn't just the smell. And there's been studies done on them. There's antibiotic-resistant bacteria, there's viruses, there's E. coli, there's hormones, there's nitrous oxide, there's hydrogen sulfide, there's ammonia. And there's documented studies done by reputable schools, since the University of Iowa Medical School, University of North Carolina Medical School, that shows that living near a CAFO, or working in a CAFO in particular, is a major health risk in terms of respiratory problem, particularly older people and children living near CAFOs. There's been studies done that children in schools that are near CAFOs, higher levels of asthma, respiratory problems, a whole host of various other things. The information is out there. The science is out there. I could go on with other things, but people are told in rural communities, despite these concerns of the people that come in and raise them, and they say, this is agriculture. And in Iowa, and Missouri also, but particularly in Iowa since I moved there, they say, Iowa's an agricultural state. The rural communities are dependent upon agriculture for their rural economy. So, you just have to put up with the risk and the nuisance and things of that nature because it's essential to the economy. Again, that simply is not true. It's not there for jobs. It employs fewer people in industrial agriculture than it does otherwise, and it should be no surprise because that process of industrialization, the specializing, move away from integrated crop and livestock systems, particular crop, livestock, specialize, standardize the process using chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, mechanisms, standardize it, make it work like a factory, consolidate into the larger operation. The big economic gains from doing that is you simplify the overall process to where you can hire people with very little training and very little skill to drive the tractors, work in the CAFOs, do all of this other stuff, and pay them less. And you can hire fewer people because you're getting more production per person. That's the reason we always had fewer farmers all the time, because we were getting bigger. Fewer farmers could produce more food. So it reduces the employment rather than increases employment in rural areas. And the data is there to show it. Even in late as 1960, 8% of the workforce was employed in farming in rural areas. Today, it's less than 1%. In fact, most of the farmers make a very small portion of the total family income off of the farm today. So agriculture isn't contributing much in that whole area. We basically destroyed the economic base. And when you look at particular industries between 1980 and 2008, the years of concentration, we lost 40% of our beef producers. We lost 90% of our independent hog producers. We've lost 80% of our independent dairy producers. And they've been replaced by far fewer workers in the large confinement animal feeding operation. Again, there's been studies done on that. We don't have to have, economic impact assessment models, which they're always using to show the employment. We've got 50 years of history now with CAFOs, and we know what happens. There was another Pew report that went back and reviewed the socioeconomic research over that period of time and looked at what happened in actual communities. There was a depression of income among some people. So a few people in the community prospered, greater income inequity, higher levels of poverty, reduced businesses within towns, as I was talking about in the 80s, main streets drying up, schools closing, the whole range of declining trade, declining rural economies, community after community when you go to the industrialization of agriculture. There's 50 years of this out here. The North Dakota Department of Attorney General's office did a survey. They reviewed 56 different academic socioeconomic studies that showed basically the same thing. The quality of life is consistently higher in communities where you have smaller independent family farms, consistently lower in places where you have the large industrial model of agriculture there. In spite of that, the people in rural communities are told, we have to have this kind of agriculture because we simply have to keep the cost of food down to the American consumer. If we changed it, it would go up, and food costs have been going down, and we have to feed the world. But again, it's simply not true. The evidence isn't there to support it. There is nothing to indicate that we couldn't have produced just as much with the smaller independent family farms as we're producing now with the industrial farms. This isn't about even increased production to keep it down. We talk about we're industrializing the dairy operation today, massive industrialization. We've had surpluses of milk for so long as I can know. We had a dairy buyout where the government bought cows and killed them because there was too much milk. We've had government programs to reduce the surplus, to turn it into cheese, whatever. We've had excesses in all of these areas before as we're going in. And there was a time whenever food costs were going down and share of income spent on food was going down as a consequence as we moved through the early stages, but that hasn't happened. The last 20 years, the massive industrialization of agriculture, the last 20 years, food costs have been going up faster than the overall rate of inflation. Any increases in economic efficiency at the farm level at that point has been more than offset by wider margins by the agri-corporations that increasingly control farm-level production through comprehensive contracts. We're paying more for food as a consequence of the corporatization of the food system than we're saving from the industrialization. I mean, the data is there. It's USDA data. You can go dig it out. The whole idea of it going up. And the people would look at alternatives, such as I'm working at sustainable agriculture, organic, biodynamic, various other things like that. And the PR says, well, it's little niche markets. They claim to be for all kinds of farmers. But they say, those kind of operations could never feed the world. Those kind of operations, food costs would go through the ceiling. It's simply not true. The academic studies that have been on it indicate that if we made a transition to sustainable organic agriculture, that sort of thing, and most food costs might go up 8 or 10%, but they've gone up more than that just because of the ethanol program. It's just, the facts are just not in place. In fact, there's a study done again, reported in the journal Nature, which is one of the most respected studies in the world, and they looked at organic versus conventional or non-organic production, and they found a well-managed organic operation, that's my experience as well, can be just as productive as a conventional operation. And if you look at what's going on in the United States, we don't need more production in this country. We're 30% of farm-level income comes from exports. It's not going into the domestic market. It's being exported somewhere else. And have been consistently burning up 40% of our corn crop for ethanol. I mean, that's not underproduction. We've got way more production than we need to eat. Our challenge is sustainability. Our challenge is creating a food system that takes care of the natural environment, that builds strong communities, that feeds people healthy food, and so on. So there's no logic to that. And the rest of the world doesn't need industrial agriculture. I surprisingly was asked by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations last year to to write the North American paper on family farming for the International Year of the Family Farm. And I wasn't totally surprised, but in doing the research on it, I found out that most of the rest of the world doesn't really want another green revolution that people talk about, contrary to the belief here. I also discovered that 70% of the people in the world today are fed off of small, what we would call subsistence farms. In many cases, they call them peasant farms. These are small farms that haven't been industrialized at this point. And there's also research that's done in South America and Africa and other places that we can double or triple the production levels on those kinds of farms without industrialization, something they call agroecology, which is like sustainability. It's working with nature, rebuilding the fertility of the soil, integrated crop and livestock system, things of this nature. If those farmers double, triple production, we could feed twice as many people in the world without industrialization. We don't need industrialization. The world doesn't need it. And the studies that have been done, in the UN studies, there's at least 5 studies now that have been done UN on global food systems that indicated, that the best hope for the future is sustainable systems, agroecology, permaculture, nature farming, what they call it in the East, and so on, things of this nature. They're moving in that particular direction and saying that this is where the future is and not in industrialization. They look back at the Green Revolution. In the early years of the Green Revolution, it produced more food for people because it was the independent farmers who were employing the practices, much like it was here in the 50s and 40s and that period of time. But over time, those bigger farms consolidate into larger farms. They're taken over by multinational corporations, and the food goes into export, and the people at home are left hungry. And that's what we've had here. It took me a long time to figure out that we have been involved in a grand experiment in industrialization, and that grand experiment has failed. We didn't feed the hungry people. We've got a higher percentage of people in this country that are classified as being food insecure or hungry than we had back in 1960, when they had a major thing called Hunger in America on CBS News that raised the level of consciousness about hunger in America. There were 5% of the people at that time that were classified as being food insecure or hungry. Now it's 15%. More than 20% of the people, the children in this country live in homes where they're not sure that they've got enough money to buy food through the end of the month, the wealthiest country in the world. That's a different kind of problem. It's a social problem. It's an income problem. People are hungry because they're poor. But the fact is, you can't solve the hunger problem by making agriculture more efficient or trying to make food cheap. We've learned that. I bought into it. That's the reason I was involved in it. And probably even more important, the people, particularly lower income people that can afford to get enough to eat, the food is making them sick. We've got an epidemic of obesity in this country and related diseases of high blood pressure and heart disease and diabetes and a whole range of cancers. We now spend twice as much on health care as we spend for food. And a big part of that is diet related. And while we were cutting the percentage of income spent on food in half, we were doubling the percentage that we spent for health care. We simply can't afford more and more cheap food. There was a study come out. It was 500 scientists in 50 countries looked at the global food security issue, and they concluded that even globally, now obesity is a bigger problem than hunger. And obesity is coming right out of that industrial food system, and I would argue there is scientific evidence it begins in the soil on the farm and works its way all through the system. Industrial agriculture, the industrial food system, is not ecologically sound. It's not socially responsible. It's not economically viable. It is not sustainable. Change is no longer an option. It is an absolute necessity. The question is not if, but the question is when. And if we don't change the system voluntarily, the system eventually will collapse. And I tell people working on sustainable agriculture, even if we're marginalized to the fringe and still only 10%, we're creating the model that somebody's going to have to use when the industrial model collapses. So why don't we know the truth? Why don't more people share my truth rather than the truth that you've probably been presented with? Why don't people know? All of this, all the references I had are on the internet, but they're all in this library, I'd bet, and a mountain of other information that's here are accessible through this library. It's out there. It's science. It's done by some of the most reputable institutions, not necessarily by the agricultural colleges because they didn't do the research, so the other colleges stepped in and have done it. But why don't we know the truth? Because we're told that these industrial agriculture operations are just the same as independent family farmers have always been. And that's what the PR campaign is about. It's trying to tell you that this so-called modern industrial agriculture is just a traditional family farm, and that family farmers are good people, and they care about their animals, and they care about the land, and they care about their communities. And they are, those that are still the independent family farmers. But the others are caught in a system over which they have no control, an industrial system that increasingly dictates what they do if they want to survive economically. And many of them are doing things that they don't like to do. And that's the reason for the Faces of the Farmer, to create an illusion so that you can maintain the public trust in agriculture. But it's fundamentally different. Industrial agriculture is driven by the economic bottom line. And when you focus simply on the economic bottom line, you're going to exploit the land, you're going to pollute the environment, you're going to destroy rural communities, and you're not going to produce food for people that don't have money. That's what we know after this grand experiment, and it's out there, and it's true. And I want to emphasize, these aren't bad people. These people are following what they're being told by their agricultural colleges, by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, by the state departments of agriculture. All say this is the future of farming. But that doesn't make it true. But I sympathize with them. I used to be one of those people that were telling them to do this. I simply don't believe it anymore. I simply don't think it's supportable by good science anymore. You know, traditional family farmers, the farmers I was writing about in the UN report that I developed for the FAO, you know, family farmers traditionally, the family and the farm were an inseparable part of the same thing. Whatever you did to the land, you were doing to the family. Whatever was good for the community was good for the family, and what was good for the community, family was good for the community. It was all part of the same thing. You know, on a real family farm, it was a diverse kind of living system that you had integrated crop and livestock systems that you put together. You built the natural fertility of the soil. The soil is alive. It was healthy. The farm, the farmer, and the community were all part of the same living dynamic whole. And within natural systems, there isn't waste. The output of waste of one system, one enterprise, becomes an input for the other. You know, the waste for one or the output of one, you value added somewhere else. So it's kind of a closed system, and the waste that goes out is waste that nature can accommodate because nature needs a certain amount of waste because that's food for nature. It was a balanced system that was put together. When we focus on the economic bottom line, you destroy that whole system, and you end up with a system that's extractive and exploiting instead of one that's regenerative and renewing and sustainable over the long run. You know, so we have an agriculture today that's regulated, that information as if we still had the diversified family farms, but it's simply not true. You know, maybe the PR campaign is right. Maybe people simply don't listen to the science or listen to the facts or look at the data or don't care about it anymore. Maybe science just doesn't change minds anymore. But you know what, folks, if you really care about sustainability and the future of humanity, because the future of humanity depends upon the sustainability of agriculture, we're still biological beings, then part of that is about integrity. Part of that is about ethics. And we can't have a sustainable agriculture or a sustainable society unless we consistently tell the truth as we know it. Regardless of whether it changes minds, we have a responsibility to do our best to discover what we think is true and to continue to share that with other people regardless of whether or not it achieves our goals. It's a matter of ethics. It's a matter of ethical, moral responsibility. You know, the only real defense against the body of science that's growing out here that raises the indictment of industrial agriculture is what I call the tobacco defense. I said I went to North Carolina in the early 70s because we needed a replacement for tobacco, we were thinking. And during that period of time, that was just the beginning of the research that was coming out linking tobacco smoking as health. And what the industry was saying at that time, not just the tobacco industry, but the agricultural people in North Carolina were saying, the evidence simply isn't there. It's inconclusive. And it continued to grow, and there's still no solid proof. It's inconclusive. And you know what? Eventually, the mountain got so high of evidence against it that they finally had to conclude that there was a health risk associated with tobacco, and we began to establish regulations to protect the public health. So, you know, the farmers say what I'm doing out here is legal, and so I'll continue to do it, and we may have to put up that for a while, but just because something is legal, because there's no law against it, doesn't mean that it's ethical, or it doesn't mean that it's moral. Slavery was once legal in this country, but it was never right to enslave another person. It was never moral. The founders of this country knew that. It was once legal to treat your wife, if you were a man, as if your wife was property. But that was never moral, and we knew that, and eventually that changed. And it was never right when you were smoking to impose your health risk on the people that were in the airplane with you or the people that were in the restaurant with you, as I did for many years. I even smoked during many of those years, but it was never right. It was never ethical. So when I talk about a battle for the hearts and minds of the American people, it's not just hearts and minds. It's a battle for the soul of the American people. It's about being an ethical citizen, which this public affairs conference is all about. You know, if we're going to have a sustainable agriculture and a sustainable society, we can't be guided simply by what's profitable and what's legal. We must also be guided by what is ethical and what is moral. That's my truth. Now it's time for yours. Thank you very much. Okay, who's first? If you have a disagreement, that's okay. I'll promise I'll listen. I may comment, but I'll listen. Yes?
I was just wondering if there's anything specific that made you change your mind about industrial agriculture.
It wasn't a specific thing, but what it was, I was chairman of the department, Extension Agricultural Economics Department at that time. When I'd just gone to Georgia. And, you know, Georgia had borrowed a lot of money during the Jimmy Carter administration. They basically were throwing money at people down there. The Farmers Home Administration was to try to impress Jimmy with how much money they were lending. And so, but I mean, these farmers got caught with big debts they couldn't pay, and we had several suicides down there, you know, which really raised the awareness. But people in my department, we got a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to go out and work with farmers and try to help them figure out some way to save the farm. So we'd have them bring their records in, their farm records in, and we'd go over and see how much equity they had left, see if they were making a profit or wasn't, because a lot of them didn't know one way or the other. And when we were, and if nothing else, you know, we tried to talk them into selling the farm when they had something left or not commit suicide. You know, it was really a really tense time. But I came to the realization that the farmers that were in the biggest difficulty were the ones that had been doing what we had been telling them to do. And that's not an easy thing to do. So it hit home to me when you see these people that are in trouble, and you were part of the cause of it. And so I said, I'm not going to continue to do that. You know, I may not be able to help them, but I'm not going to continue to talk them into something that's going to cause this much misery. And so I was, you know, talking to real farmers across the table, and I said, okay, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a different way. And about that time, the sustainable agriculture movement was coming on, and I just decided that basically ended my administrative career. Whenever I started questioning the university and started saying, I don't believe in this anymore, I went around the state with a program called It's Not Your Fault. And I was telling the farmers, you're caught in a system, you were following advice that so-called experts were telling you, and it's not your fault. And so after I did that, you know, basically my administrative career was over, and I decided I need to find someplace else. So the more I learned about sustainable agriculture, the more sense it made to me. You know, it's about making a living. It's the kind of way I grew up. It was kind of like the old balanced farming program in Missouri back in the 30s and 40s. It's about making a living, but it's about taking care of the land and about being a good member of the community and taking care of family. It's a balanced approach to agriculture, and I think that's what I look for, is a balanced approach to life. You know, we're material beings, and we need to meet our economic needs, but we're also social beings. We need relationships with other people. That's an important part of what makes life good. And we're also ethical and moral beings. We need a sense of purpose and meaning. We need to feel that what we're doing is right and good. The best of our ability. We need that. And I was saying, if that's what we know as individual people, why shouldn't we be farming that way? Why shouldn't we be running our businesses this way? Why shouldn't we run our government this way? The more I understood about it. So it was just during that time, it was a crisis for me, a personal crisis and a professional crisis, but it was a crisis for the farmers. And that's what changed me, and I would just continue to try to understand, where we're going with this. So I appreciate the question. Yes?
Can you give us some advice for students going into the agriculture industry, and just maybe your opinions on the future of agriculture and what industry, the part of the industry?
Give advice on what
students going into the agriculture industry. Can you give us any advice?
Give you advice on agriculture?
Or no, students who are studying agriculture now. Can you give us
Yeah,
advice?
students that are studying agriculture now?
Yeah, is it still a good industry to go into?
I think the most important thing I tell people, I have a hard time hearing young people. I have hearing aids in, but there's a limit to what you can do to the old ears when they begin to wear out. But when people ask me, how do you prepare for a career in sustainable agriculture, sustainable food system, there's going to be a lot of opportunities beyond just farming, because we have to recreate the whole food system all the way to the consumer. And we're doing that with local food systems. But the most important thing, I think, is to get a good, broad, general education. The fundamental purpose of education, in my mind, is to figure out how the world works and where you fit within it, so you can figure out how to live your life. So sustainability is this broad area, but you need to understand enough about what's going on in nature so that you can work in harmony with nature, be ecologically sound, that sort of thing. But you also need the understanding of society and relationships and getting along with people and all of that. And then you need an understanding of economics and how you're going to make a living out here. But that's a broad kind of understanding. So if you get that kind of foundation for it, and then you begin to figure out what it is I want to do within, whether I want to be a farmer, whether I want to be involved in the food system, and then you begin to try to learn more about those things. But I think a lot of that comes from practical experience, internships, and knowledge that you're going to get in the field. Because I don't think the knowledge beyond that is really specific, because it's not like industrial agriculture where there are certain practices you follow and things that you have to do. The people that I know that are really good in sustainable agriculture, they'll tell you that you need, before you start farming, you need to work on a organic sustainable farm for a couple of 3 years anyway. And then after you really start farming, then it's probably going to take another 4 or 5 years before you really get into it. So it's very knowledge intensive, but as a consequence of that, there's a high return to the person. Not just, you're not going to get rich doing this. That's not what it's about. But there's also the personal rewards, but there's a higher return than there is in the industrial operation. So you can take a few acres and make a good living. I recently I write a regular column for an online journal called the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. I recently wrote one where I did some research, and there's people, in the whole area of sustainable agriculture that, like a couple make $100,000 a year, or single $50,000. That would kind of be on the upscale. It's not big salary, but that's livable, and then that includes, a place to live, and a lot of your food and a lot of other things come with the farm. But I think get a good broad education and then begin to build on that in the specific area that you're interested in, and you'll probably have to get a lot of that, kind of on-the-job training sort of thing. Does that help? There's nothing wrong with having a good general education anyway. The world's going to change so much in the next 50 years that most of the technical stuff you learn will be out of date anyway. So, yes.
Is there another country that's a model of successful, sustainable agriculture?
I don't know of another whole country that's a model, but there's certainly countries that are way ahead of us in doing that. There's the countries of Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and those countries are far ahead. I was over in I guess it was Finland. I was over there 5 or 6 years ago, and their goal was to be 50% organic by now. I don't know whether they made it. They thought it was a little bit ambitious, to go to 50% organic, but Sweden is probably 25% organic, something like that. A lot of those countries have banned routine use of antibiotics. Denmark, I think, was one that did that recently. So there's countries that are moving further in that direction. Costa Rica is a country I visited recently that, they're trying to hold on. They've got a big industrial operations that are moving in from outside down there. But there's a lot of countries that haven't gone as far as we have. It's going to be more difficult here than about anywhere to change agriculture because it's so ingrained in the psyche here. It's so institutionalized here.
I would like to add to.
Go ahead.
Cuba is a country that is essentially sustainable because they were poor. They didn't have the funds to be able to purchase pesticides or anything like that. So they are actually models for other countries around the world: Australia, Canada. If you look it up, you'll find that research. Yep,
that's a good comment. I'm glad you added that. There's a good film out by Community called Community Solutions. You remember the name? Anybody remember the name of that? But it's called Community Solutions. If you go on there and Google it, they went down and did a documentary in Cuba showing that. They went through a painful kind of transition process, but at the end of it, they're healthier, happier, better fed, whole range of things. Yes?
All right. So as you mentioned, America is more industrialized, and I'm kind of wondering, to go backwards as far as we probably need to go, how can you increase interest? A lot of people view farming as kind of a lower income, old traditional farming as kind of a lower income. You mentioned making a living,
Okay.
but it's not everyone's goal to make a living. It seems like it's most people's goal to get ahead.
If you're talking about get rich, why do something else for a living? Real sustainable farming is, in that paper I wrote, I said it's like a helping occupation. It's like being a nurse or a fireman or a school teacher or something like that. It's not something where you're going to get up. If you go out and get rich in agriculture, you're going to end up in industrial agriculture. You're going to end up right back where we started. So I just say that right up front. But it's about a better way of life. I tell people if you don't think that your purpose for being here on earth is to be a farmer, then find what it is you're put here to do. But if you think farming is what's going to make you happy, it's going to be your way of life, then you can find a way to make a good living without destroying the earth and without, destroying the quality of life of your neighbors. You can find a way to do it sustainably if that's really what you're doing. And I would remind people that if that's what you want to do and that's your chosen lifestyle, so if you make some money over and above, some profit over and above that on the farm. Let's say you get married and you go out here and you raise kids on the farm and you got some cash income, make $25,000, $30,000 a year, okay? You say, well, that's not much. But you look at another young couple that gets out of here and both of them go to work in the city and both of them are making $100,000, $150,000 a year. And if they're like the average American couple, they're spending virtually every penny of that to buy the way of life that they want to live and the lifestyle that they want to live. So they may be using a lot more dollars to do it, but they're just achieving their desired lifestyle. And if farming is what you want to do, you've achieved your desired lifestyle, right? And so you're better off if you want to farm than they are. You're a lot better off in doing what they do and you not liking it, not wanting to go to work and not liking your job and not feeling good about it, and then just breaking even or not getting ahead. And I'm telling you the truth, and you know that. Most of the young couples go out here and they get a big house and a car payment and 2 or 3 kids and save for college and things like that, and pretty soon they're just barely getting by. So the important thing is decide what you want to do with your life. You only got one of those. And I spent too much of mine, in my opinion, doing stuff that I don't believe in now. If you can find what it is you really want to do, it doesn't make sense that you've been given a purpose you can't do. I mean, that would be a cruel world, is to say, well, I'm going to put these people down here and I'm going to tell them they have to do something they can't do. I don't believe it's that way. So it's you can make a living, and I know a lot of people that are making a good living. I know Francis Tickey is, I met him. He's a dairy farmer north of Fairfield. He's milking about 90 cows, Jersey cows. He bottles his own milk, makes yogurt and ice cream and various other things. And he sells all of his milk within about 10-mile radius of his farm. When I first met him is when I went to USDA in Washington, D.C., and he was the Agricultural Extension Program Leader for Soil Science, PhD from Minnesota, I think, wherever it was. And he said, well, I think I'm going to go back to the dairy farm. And I thought, oh, sure, you're going to give up this bureaucratic. Well, sure enough, he did. But he's gone back there, and he makes a good living. He built a nice house. He takes a lot of time off, does a lot of educational work. He ran for Secretary of Agriculture just for the heck of getting his ideas out. But he made a good living, you know. You can make a good living on a farm. It's just that you can't get rich. Yes?
Could you reiterate your opinion from an economic standpoint comparing industrial ag to sustainable ag?
Yeah, from an economic standpoint?
Yeah.
The economic advantage of industrial agriculture, the kind of systems that I talk about, come almost entirely from the ability to impose those external environmental costs and social costs on the community around them. And I'll just give you this as evidence from an economic standpoint. We have technologies today that we could easily take care of the public health problems from the large-scale confinement animal feeding operations. Just to start with, we could use the same technologies we use on municipalities, on humans, because it's very similar. But we have systems that are less than that. But the industry will do studies, and they do them every time you impose the regulations, and they say, this is not economically feasible. And what does that say? It says if I had to operate this in such a way that I couldn't release these pollutants into the environment, pollute the streams the way I am now, if I had to treat animal waste like you would treat human waste, or not even get that far, but come close to it, then I couldn't compete. They're saying it's not economically feasible. We have technology today that could control the odors, and some of them are beginning to put them in. It would dramatically reduce these particulates that are getting in there and making people sick. But they say this is not economically feasible. What they're saying is that from our economic analysis, if we had to do that, then we couldn't compete with the hog operations or with the other operations. And whenever you talk to the people about reducing the nitrogen input that's going into the stream, so that we have to build these water purification plants to get excess nitrogen, what they say is if we had to farm in such a way that didn't get into the streams, then we couldn't make a living on those farms. And I'm saying their own economic analysis says that they couldn't farm in a way that didn't pollute the streams, that didn't pollute the air, that didn't spread raw sewage, and be economically competitive. And I think other economic analysis would show the same thing, but that's their economic analysis. Okay. Yes.
From my experience and what I've learned, GMOs, are particularly Roundup Ready and herbicide-resistant crops, have become essential in soil conservation and reducing the runoff into streams. And just the way you put it, it sounds like industrial and sustainable are opposites, and the way I kind of see it, they're more intertwined.
Right.
What do you?
Well, I think they're opposite ways of thinking. I'm not saying that there aren't technologies that will work in one that wouldn't work in the other, but until you change kind of the ways of thinking about it, then you're not going to address the problem, because you go with the GMO crops, and you're going now with we talked about Roundup. Roundup was supposed to be safe. It wasn't supposed to cause any human harm or whatever, but most of those no-till systems depend upon a herbicide like Roundup, to kill back the crops and things of that nature. And so you have a system that may be no-till, but at the same time you've got a system that's not environmentally sound. So you may be reducing erosion. And I think there's even some question about that. But you may be reducing erosion, but at the same time you're creating another problem. And I would argue the reason they went to the no-till systems was not really because it was soil conservation. It's because the no-till systems allowed you to farm more acres. There were fewer passes across the field, and you could have a bigger farming operation with a no-till system. And it had the side advantage that you were reducing the erosion somewhat. But it's not about individual technologies. Back in the early days of sustainability, the people kept looking for, well, what are the technologies of sustainability? It's not the technologies, it's how you put them together in a system. that deals with the environmental issues, the soil conservation issues, the water quality, the human health issues, food safety issues, and the community provides opportunities for people to make a living. And that's what industrial agriculture doesn't do. We basically destroyed agriculture as an occupation. The people that work, they'll say, okay, we're going to bring in these CAFOs and it's going to provide employment in the local community. The people that work in the CAFOs end up not being people that were unemployed in the local community. Almost invariably, there's people that will move in from outside, usually from other countries. And I'm certainly not opposed to racial diversity or having people come in the communities. I've said many times that one of the most positive things, if there is one about CAFOs, it'll probably increase the racial diversity of rural America, which will be a good thing. But it doesn't provide jobs for local people, because the local people, this isn't farming. This isn't what they expected. They won't work in the hog houses. They won't milk cows in the milk factories and things like that. So they bring in people that are desperate for work that come in from Mexico and other countries that will take the jobs in the packing houses and in the CAFOs and things. And in the state of, there's one report that I cite, and I can't remember the exact statistics, but you can find it online. But in the state of Wisconsin, the dairy state, so to speak, as they were going into CAFOs, the percent of immigrant workforce increased from like 8% to 40% in the matter of about 7 years. Well, it's not because nobody in Wisconsin knows how to milk cows. My gosh, that's the dairy state. It's just that the people that were milking cows in Wisconsin would not work in the big CAFO operations because of the way they operate. And so they brought in people outside to milk the cows. And again, you end up with a lot of good Mexican restaurants and a lot more diverse communities than you had before, which is a good thing. But it's not it's not honest in that you're not providing employment for local people like they said they would. Does that make sense? And it happens over and over again. Yes?
Do you have any advice on being an informed consumer as far as GMOs and sustainability?
Doing what?
Do you have any advice on being an informed consumer?
Informed on GMOs?
Yeah.
I'd say read Stephen Drucker's new book. You start from there. I don't give endorsements to books like that very often, but he happened to be Fairfield, Iowa, where I live now, is kind of the hotbed of the GMO opposition. Jeffrey Smith, who wrote Genetic Roulette and a few other things, lives up there. But anyway, Stephen Drucker happened to be there, and there were scientists there, but that knew scientists in other places that were concerned about the GMOs. And so the reason I'm recommending his book is he was representing these scientists in a long, strung-out court case. And because he was the lawyer, then he was able to get access to the documents about the process by which GMOs were approved and released and all of these sorts of things. So he had access to the internal documents that nobody else could get unless they were involved in a legal action of some sort that give him the need to know that in order to present his case. And also, since he's a lawyer, he's very meticulous, and he wanted to get everything straight. Sometimes you go on and on and on. But I learned things I didn't know, and he really documents this, the most troublesome thing. He really documents the corruption of the academic community, and the government agencies as well. He traces that. But the corruption of the academic community and the influence of corporations on the academic community and the various scientific associations that just came out with information that had no scientific basis to it. It came out with assertions to the fact that research has been done that had never been done, and that something had happened in a certain way when it didn't happen that way, and he documents clearly why it didn't. But he also explains in detail what some of the concerns are. For example, I'll just give you one real quickly. They say, well, it's basically the same as you would get transferring a gene through normal crop breeding, let's say. So what I didn't know before, they don't just transfer the gene that they want to transfer from one to the other, because there's something in here, I don't remember the name of it, that turns that gene on and off. Genes don't just stay on all the time. They function in relation to the body. There are certain times you need the gene to express, and other times it's not expressed, and it's expressed in relation to other genes and things of that nature. So they transfer the gene, but the gene doesn't have any way of turning on and off in the new one. So they have to transfer something to turn it on and off, but that thing that turns it on and off can't communicate with the new organism. And so what they do is they turn it on so that they make sure it's expressed. And just to make sure that it gets expressed in a way you can measure, they rev it up to about 4 times its normal expression level. And so you've got something that's supposed to be turning on and off in relation to when the body needs a certain thing or needs something else. That's now in the new organism, but it's on all the time, and it's expressing at about 4 or 5 times or 10 times whatever the normal level. Now you can just kind of imagine that that's not normal, folks. That wouldn't happen under a normal crop breeding process. You wouldn't have that transfer unless it was in such a way that it, worked in harmony with the organism and things of that nature. And then he goes on to explain all sorts of problems that can arise out of that sort of relationship. And then all of the different things that are involved in transferring the genes. You're also transferring viruses that implants the gene in the new organism. It has to have a virus that can penetrate the cell. Well, the virus is still there. So you didn't just transfer the gene, and you didn't just transfer a single gene, you transferred a bunch of stuff. And then when you're using a gene gun, you're splattering it with a whole bunch of stuff, and then you pick out whatever you're looking for and say, well, we got that, but you don't look at everything else you've splattered into there. So anyway, read the book, yeah.
How would you say to put in a crop then? Because whenever we conventionally till, we erode the land, but then if we use the Roundup not to erode the land, but try to keep the soil in place, but then plant that in there, but that is environmentally doing it. So both ways that are now in practice are wrong. So how would you try and...
Well, there's various ways you can do it. Of course, you can go on the contour, and then you can strip till, and then you can come in and you can have no till and not use the pesticides on it, but you have to have a cover crop, and then you have to get the cover crop down at the right time. You can cut it down or some way other than use the herbicide on it and go to a no-till system within that. But you've got to bring a cover crop into the rotation that you can use to suppress the weeds while the new crop's going. And all of these alternatives are more sophisticated, complicated kind of systems. But we've gone to this industrial system because it's simple and we have a recipe. And when we tend to look for solutions, then give me another simple solution. Well, there isn't another simple solution, but there's a solution there that people are using consistently that will work in these operations. And I would argue from what I've seen recently that many of the people that go to the minimum till, not necessarily the no-till, but people that go into the minimum tillage and things of that nature and leave residue, a lot of times the residue isn't there. We're not getting the benefit we think we get it. They do it to conservation compliance, and it's not really as effective as we do it. But these alternatives, are not necessarily simple, but there's people out there doing it. If I didn't have an opportunity to go out and speak to people at conferences, I didn't mention the conference. There's at least 8 conferences in this country today that will draw over 1,000 people. And some of them, like the Upper Midwest Organic Growers up at La Crosse, Wisconsin, about 3,500 people go there. And these are people that have the alternative vision of sustainability and eco-farming and all of that. And I have opportunity to go out and speak with these groups. There's all kinds of them, 400 or 500 people. But if I wasn't out here talking on a regular basis with people actually doing the things that I'm talking about, then I'd just stay home and shut up. I don't know everything that they're doing. I'm just saying I know people that are out there that are doing it, and they're very intelligent people, and they're well informed, and they could be farming any way they want to, and they chose to farm this way. Yes.
What do you think would happen to the livestock industry if, say, feeding medication to beef cattle was banned? Because
I think
we feed medication to our beef cattle, and we run about 600 cows. It's not a huge farm, but we do it for the welfare of the animal, and we have really healthy livestock. But at the same time, if it's bad for the consumer, you have an alternative to the medication that would make the livestock healthy.
Yeah, I think you'd have to change the nature of the system that you're in if you cut out the medication. And again, there's people that have organic operations on livestock that aren't using the routine medication. And when they banned the routine feeding of antibiotics even in the confinement operations in Denmark, they had high death losses for a period of time and sickness until they changed the nature of their operation to accommodate the fact that they couldn't have that routine feeding anymore. And so I think you change the nature until you get till you get to the point where you've got basically healthy animals without the antibiotics. And my friend of mine that I was telling you about that has the 90 cows, he has a pasture-based dairy operation and things of this nature, and he has practically no medical bills. He doesn't feed anything routinely, but he has practically no illness that has to be treated by having a veterinarian out. And I've talked to other people in the beef industry that do the same thing. They'd probably have to have more space, and you'd have to have a healthier environment. You might have to rotate, might have to put them out on grass and rotate the grazing amount among those cattle if they're cow-calf operation. Rotate the grazing, maybe bring in some multi-species grazing with sheep or goats or something like that to come in between so that you can break the cycles of the what am I thinking about? Various worming things and things of that nature. So it's changing the whole management system. But again, there's people that are doing it, and it's working. And I'd just say, if you're really interested in exploring, these farming systems, these are all good questions, but go to one of these. They had the Missouri Organic Growers Conference here in Springfield a couple of months ago. That would have been one close by you can go to. But go to one of these big conferences and sit in on these sessions. These big conferences, it's mostly not university professors or USDA people. It's mostly farmers that are actually doing these things, that are sharing information with other farmers. That's a good thing about them. But go and talk to other farmers that are actually doing it. You had another question? Go ahead.
Yeah, so you said that the organic producers in Denmark, and as you keep referring to, that there are ways that it's less expensive kind of. Could you tell me the percent income that they spend per year on their food compared to the U.S. maybe?
The percent of income
spent on food.
Well, I don't know specifically what percent of income they spend on food, but I go back to the studies that have been done here, that if we had the transition of the system, we're probably talking about food cost increases of maybe 8 to maybe 12% on total. And a big part of that, particularly in this country and countries like in Europe, and they'd have a higher percentage over there because a lot of things different about their system. It's not just the antibiotics, a lot of things. But the thing is that, let's see, when you change over to, you talk about changing the farming system, 80% of what we spend on the food in this country is not the farm level cost of the food itself. It's processing, transportation, advertising, a whole range of other stuff. So if we increased the cost of food, let's say by 50%, and I think that's 10% of the retail price. So if you increase what farmers get by 50%, if the rest of the system was as efficient as it is now, then retail food prices would only go up 10%. See what I'm getting at?
I'm wondering, because you stated earlier that it was more of a money problem than a food problem because we were producing cheap food, right, but it was a money problem. Yep. So,
well, what I'm talking about here on producing cheap food and hunger is it's not the countries of Europe aren't doing any better than we are. Canada isn't doing any better. Canada has about the same percentage of income spent on food that we do, and they have about the same percentage of hungry people that we do in Canada as well. That's just not something you're going to solve by making food cheap. You've got to deal with income problems there. People are hungry because they're poor. And, instead of producing more food for hungry people, the poor people, what we're doing is we Americans can afford to spend more for the corn crop to put into our automobiles than the poor people can afford to pay for it to go into food. So as long as you have a market economy, then the wealthy people are going to spend money for whatever it is they want from agriculture, and they're going to be paying a higher price than the poor people can. And so I'm just saying that's a problem that has to be solved through the social services or through rethinking. I argue I'm going to give a talk in Chicago Thursday night on food sovereignty. And food sovereignty starts with the premise that every human being has a basic right to food. Not to be left to charity, not to be left to markets. Every human being has a basic right to enough healthful food to meet their basic human needs. And if you start from the premise that everyone has a right to food rather than leaving it to the market, then you begin to design a whole different set of programs to deal with that. I'm just saying that making food cheap is not the answer to that problem. We have to deal with that somewhere else. Okay? That's all I'm trying to get at here. Come to Chicago Thursday night and I'll talk about the alternative. Okay.
So do you think the GMO is safe for the human being? And would you eat the GMF, the genetically modified food?
Yeah, I don't know whether GMOs are safe or not, and I don't think anybody else does. And what we have now is you have people arguing, well, we've had GMOs for 20 years, and we haven't had people associated with that, haven't had people killing over dead and things of that nature. But you look at what's happened to diet-related problems that could be related to GMOs, and you find a whole range. There's a scientific study, I referenced like 22 different illnesses that could be. I didn't say they would be. But if you could look out and say that there's no increase in illnesses that could be related to GMOs during that period of time, then you could say there's evidence is they're safe. I'm just saying we don't know, and neither does anyone else. And I think it's right for people to say, look, I'd rather not participate in this experiment. And I think there's ways of avoiding GMO foods now because everything isn't genetically modified. There's about a dozen or so crops. If you want to go genetic roulette and various other things. The internet, you can go and, I can't remember the name of some of the websites now, but you can go and find out that the crops that mainly are corn and soybeans and now alfalfa and papaya and, does anybody else have others?
Yellow squash.
What's that?
Yellow squash.
Yellow squash. But you can avoid eating the things that have GMOs in it, even though you don't know specifically whether that crop was. You can avoid those kind of things. And it changes your diet considerably because a lot of the processed foods have corn and soy in it that's GMO modified and things of that nature. But you can go on the internet again. You can find, you're probably in the library. I shouldn't be saying the internet. Come to the library and and they'll find the references that will tell you how to eat a GMO-free diet. Okay. I guess we're about ready to round up. We got one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so it was mentioned earlier that Cuba has become pretty sustainable as a country. And we had an ag forum recently where Blake Hurst and Senator Blunt spoke, and the issue of Cuba and world trade came up. And Senator Blunt made the statement that he doesn't agree with starting specifically agricultural trade with Cuba because they don't have any money to pay for that. So do you feel like sustainable ag would, I'm just trying to see opinions here.
Yeah, I think people in the sustainable agriculture movement would welcome trade and welcome relationships with Cuba, and they'd figure we could learn things from them, and they could learn things from us. And it wouldn't just be about money. The sustainable agriculture movement, I'll kind of finish on this, it's not just about money. It's about making a living, but it's about a way of life. And I think the most important thing in terms of the transition of sustainable agriculture and sustainable food system, everything else, begins in our head. It begins with the realization that we're not just material beings. We need food, clothing, shelter, the things that money buy. But we're also social beings. We need relationships with other people, like Cuba and like Russia and like people all over the world. We need better relationships with them. We need better relationships with people within our communities and within our families. And that takes time and it takes energy. And a lot of those relationships, there's nothing of economic value you're going to get back. Some of them there may be, but there's a lot of relationships. But those are important to our quality of life. And there's a whole host of scientific studies I call the happiness research that shows that as countries develop up to about $10,000 to $15,000 per person, that there's a real increase in quality of life because you're getting those essentials of life. But beyond about $10,000 to $15,000 per person, there's no correlation, there's no relationship between increased wealth and increased happiness. It's the quality of relationships in families and communities that matters, and it's back to that having some sense of purpose and meaning. Feeling good about what you're doing, feeling good about how you treat other people, feeling good about your responsibility to future generations. And I argue that this transition to a more sustainable economy, sustainable agriculture, is really an opportunity for a major step forward for humanity to move toward this ethical citizen as a way to improve our quality of life, to move toward spending time on relationships as a way to improve our quality of life. Those things don't require more energy, they don't require more natural resources, they just require more attention, more caring, more sharing. And I think when we change our mind and say, I want to live a good life, and it'll take some economic well-being, material well-being, but I want to live in a way that I feel good about the way I treat my neighbors and my friends, and I feel good about what I'm leaving to future generations. I want to live a life that I can really feel good about. Be an ethical citizen, right? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.